Tonight, I am about to tell you a story of a man whose crimes were so unspeakable that they blurred the line between nightmares and reality. It is said that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, but instead, the real monsters are the ones who walk among us. They smile, they laugh, they blend in, they might even serve you dinner. This is the story of Joe Metheny, a man who wasn't just a monster. He was a chef, a businessman, a predator, and his specialty were burgers. But these weren't just any ordinary burgers. These were made from human flesh. When I first heard about Joe Metheny, it wasn't from a headline or a news report. It wasn't from some horror documentary or crime podcast. No, it came from an old man sitting at the corner of a near-empty diner just outside Baltimore. It was late, close to midnight, the kind of night where the roads feel endless and the world seems just a little too quiet. I had stopped in for a coffee, maybe a slice of pie, something to break the monotony of the long drive ahead. That's when I noticed him. The man had a face carved by time, deep lines, tired eyes, and hands that shook slightly as he stirred his drink. He was talking to the waitress, his voice low, almost a whisper. At first, I wasn't listening, but then I caught a word, just one, Metheny. It was the way he said it, like a curse, like something he didn't want to be speaking aloud. The waitress stiffened, gave him a sharp look, and walked away without another word. That should have been my sign to ignore it, to mind my own business, but curiosity is a funny thing. I turned to him casually, pretending not to have been eavesdropping. "Who is Metheny?" I asked. The old man's eyes flickered to mine. He studied me for a long moment before chuckling under his breath. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh people make when they know something awful and are debating whether or not to share it. "You really don't want to know," he muttered. I should have listened. I should have let it go. But I didn't. For a while, he didn't speak. He just looked down at his coffee, watching the cream swirl into darkness. Then, finally, "You ever stop at one of those roadside food stands?" he asked. His voice was slow, deliberate. He asked, "Ever wonder where the meat comes from?" I felt something shift in the air between us. The diner, once warm and familiar, suddenly felt colder. The old man leaned in, lowering his voice even further, and said, "There was a man, a big man, Joe Metheny. He ran one of those stands, and let's just say, people loved his burgers. They never knew what was in them." My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. The old man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He didn't buy his meat," he said. "He found it." The words settled between us like a heavy fog. I could have stopped him there. I could have laughed it off, waved it away as an urban legend. But instead, I leaned in closer, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I asked, "Tell me everything." And so he did. He told me about the murders, about the bodies, about the secret ingredient that made Joe Metheny's burgers so unique. He told me about the butcher who didn't waste a single scrap. And as he spoke, my coffee sat untouched, my appetite gone, because suddenly I wasn't so sure if I had ever, unknowingly, eaten something I shouldn't have. The old man didn't rush his story. He took his time, sipping his coffee between sentences, letting each word sink in. I sat there, silent, my hands curled around my now cold cup. The hum of the diner felt distant, like white noise in the background of something far more important. The old man finally said, "Joe Metheny wasn't always a monster, at least, not in the way people think. He wasn't born evil. He didn't wake up one day and decide to start butchering people." He paused, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. His fingers trembled slightly and said, "Monsters like him aren't born, they are made by the society." I swallowed hard. The air inside the diner felt heavy now, pressing down on me. "Where did he come from?" I asked. The old man let out a slow breath. "Baltimore," he said. "Born in the early 50s. His father died when he was young. His mother worked all the time, too busy to notice the kind of boy she was raising, and so Joe, Well, he learned to take care of himself, grew up on the streets, got into trouble young. I nodded slightly. I had heard stories like this before, a rough childhood, neglect, anger simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't unusual, but something about the way the old man said it made me uneasy. He was always big, he continued. Bigger than the other kids, and strong, that kind of strength. It changes how people treat you, makes you feel like you're in control, and Joe, he liked control. His fingers tapped against his coffee cup, a slow, steady rhythm. By the time he was in his 20s, he was bouncing between jobs, truck driver, crane operator. He worked hard when he had to, drank when he didn't. But the thing about Joe was, he had a temper, and when that temper flared, people got hurt. I shifted in my seat. Hurt how? The old man gave me a long, measured look. You ever seen a man snap? I mean really snap. No warning, no build-up. Just 1 second, everything's normal, and the next, there's blood on the walls. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That was Joe, he said, except for a long time he kept it quiet. People disappeared, sure, but back then Baltimore was rough. A man goes missing and most folks don't ask questions. A chill crawled up my spine. So what changed? I asked. The old man's eyes darkened. His wife, he murmured. For the first time his voice wavered, just slightly. She left him, took their son, vanished without a trace, and Joe, well, he didn't take it well. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The way he said it, it wasn't just sadness, it wasn't just anger, it was something else, something dangerous. He went looking for her. The old man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Searched the city, asked around, but she was gone, slipped into the cracks of Baltimore's underworld, lost to drugs, to the streets, to something worse. His fingers curled into a fist, and that was the night Joe Metheny stopped being just another angry man. I exhaled slowly, waiting. The old man's eyes locked onto mine. That was the night he killed his first victim. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above us. Outside, the road stretched into the dark, empty and silent. And for the first time, I realized I didn't want to be here anymore. The night was thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the air feel heavy. Joe Metheny wandered through the streets of Baltimore, his mind clouded with rage. He had searched everywhere, shelters, bars, the back alleys where lost souls drifted, but his wife was nowhere to be found. The anger inside him boiled, turned into something deeper, something darker. He wanted revenge, not just on her, but on everyone like her. The ones who vanished into the city's underbelly, who left wreckage behind without a second thought. And that's when he saw them, two men slumped against the side of an abandoned factory, lost in a haze of whatever poison they had put into their veins. They were nobodies, just more forgotten souls swallowed by the streets. But to Joe, they were symbols. They were stand-ins for the people who had taken his wife, for the ones who had stolen his son. He approached slowly. They barely noticed him until it was too late. The first man didn't even have time to react. Joe's hands, massive and calloused from years of labor, wrapped around his throat. The man's eyes bulged, his fingers clawing at Joe's arms, but the struggle was brief. The second man tried to run, but Metheny was too fast. The chase was short, ending in the shadows beneath a rusted overpass. A rock, heavy and jagged, became Joe's weapon. The city's noise swallowed the sickening sound of bone cracking. For the first time in his life, Joe Metheny felt something close to peace. The bodies didn't stay hidden for long. The police found them within days, but no one suspected Joe. He wasn't even on their radar, and that only fed his hunger. Murder wasn't enough. Killing was just an act, a brief release of pressure. But Joe wanted something more. He wanted control, the kind that didn't end when the body hit the ground. And so he waited, he watched, he learned. Until one night, beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, he took his next victim. This time, a woman. This time, he didn't just kill her, he brought her home. The warehouse was dark, the air thick with the scent of rust and old oil. It was the perfect place, forgotten, abandoned, a hollow, doubt shell that no one cared about. Joe Metheny had claimed it as his own, a place where no one would hear the screams. He dragged the woman's lifeless body inside, his breath slow, methodical. This was different from before. The first 2 kills had been fueled by rage, a blind reaction to his own loss. But this was deliberate. He stood over her, eyes scanning the limp form sprawled across the dirt, streaked floor. The world had never given him control, never let him decide how things would go. But here in this place with her, he was in charge. He worked in silence, moving with a patience that should have been unnatural for a man his size. The first cut was clean, precise. Flesh parted under the edge of his knife, exposing the red beneath. He had butchered animals before, but this was different. The texture, the smell, it was all too familiar, yet strangely foreign. Piece by piece, he disassembled what had once been a person, and as he worked, an idea took root in his mind, curling around his thoughts like a slow, growing vine. Meat was meat. The realization was both horrifying and exhilarating. He wasn't just disposing of a body. He was repurposing it, making sure nothing went to waste. Society had thrown him away, treated him like a monster. But here he was, turning their filth into something useful. By the time dawn began to creep in through the warehouse's broken windows, the transformation was complete. The woman was gone, reduced to neatly packed portions wrapped in plastic. Joe Metheny stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a provider, and soon the world would taste his work. Joe Metheny sat in the dim light of his warehouse, staring at the neatly wrapped packages of meat. It was a moment of clarity, a revelation in the filth and darkness. He had done something few men had the stomach for. He had taken control, not just over life and death, but over what came after. Meat was meat. It was an idea that settled in his mind like an old truth. It wasn't insanity, not to him. It was efficiency. It was resourcefulness, and now it was time to see if the world agreed. Baltimore was a city of hunger, of people who worked long hours, who needed a quick, cheap meal, who never asked questions as long as the food was hot and the price was right. The kind of city where a man with a grill and a plan could thrive. Joe Metheny didn't just kill for pleasure, he had a vision, so he got to work. The setup was simple, a small roadside stand, nothing fancy. Just a grill, a cooler packed with his special supply, and a hand-painted sign advertising fresh beef burgers cheap. The first few days were quiet. People walked by, barely glancing at him, but Joe was patient. He knew the hunger would bring them in eventually, and then one day a man in a construction vest stopped. "Smells good," he said, rubbing his stomach. "How much?" Joe smiled. "Just a couple bucks." The man nodded. "I'll take 2. Joe worked the grill with steady hands, watching as the patties sizzled and browned, the fat dripping onto the open flames. He had chosen his blend carefully, mixing his unique ingredient with just enough real beef to make the taste familiar. The first bite had to be perfect, unquestionable. The customer took a huge bite, chewed thoughtfully, then grinned. "Damn, this is good. What's in it?" Joe chuckled. "Family recipe." The man shrugged, taking another bite. "Whatever it is, you got something special here." Joe nodded. He knew. Word spread fast. The working men, the drifters, the people who lived paycheck to paycheck, they all came. His burgers were cheap, they were filling, and best of all, they were delicious. No one questioned where the meat came from. No one ever does, not when it's cheap enough. Day after day, he served them, fed them, and every time he handed over a freshly grilled patty, he felt a thrill deep in his chest. A private joke that no one else was in on. He wasn't just feeding the city, he was making them a part of something they would never understand. They weren't just eating his food, they were eating his work. And they loved it. Joe Metheny had always been a man of appetites, whether it was for food, control, or violence. But now, his cravings had merged into something new, something terrifying. Killing had given him a thrill, but this gave him purpose. The meat was handled with care, cleaned, cut, and stored with the precision of a skilled butcher. He knew exactly how to process it, which parts were best, which needed seasoning, and how to make it indistinguishable from the cuts people bought every day. The idea simmered in his mind for days, turning over and over until it became a full-fledged plan. He needed a way to get rid of the evidence, a way to ensure that every trace of his crimes vanished. But more than that, he wanted people to consume it, to unknowingly take part in what he had done. That was when he decided to start selling food. It started small, a roadside stand, nothing fancy, just a grill, a cooler, and a cheap sign offering fresh home-made burgers for an unbeatable price. He set up in an area where truckers passed through, where late night workers needed a quick bite before heading home, the kind of people who didn't ask too many questions. His first customer was a man in his 40s, a tired-looking trucker who had pulled over just to stretch his legs. Joe greeted him with an easy smile, flipping the patty over the sizzling flames. The smell was intoxicating, rich, smoky, mouth-watering. The trucker took his first bite, chewing slowly before nodding in approval. "Damn," he said, wiping his mouth. "This is good. What's in it?" Joe just grinned, his hands steady as he prepared another burger. "Just a special blend," he said. The man didn't ask further. Word spread quickly. The stand became a local favorite, a hidden gem for those passing through. People came and went, licking the grease from their fingers, praising the flavor, asking for more. And all the while, Joe watched them, his smile never faltering. He was feeding them pieces of the lost, the forgotten, the ones no one would come looking for. It became a cycle. He would go out at night, find someone who wouldn't be missed. He knew the streets well, knew which corners held the desperate, the addicted, the ones society had abandoned. He would lure them in, sometimes with food, sometimes with promises of work or shelter. Once they were inside his warehouse, it was over. He took his time with them, savoring the process. It wasn't just about the kill anymore. It was about the craft. He perfected his methods, found ways to make the meat more tender, more flavorful, the right balance of fat and lean muscle. The customers never knew. They came back, week after week, craving that same unique taste. Some even brought their friends. Joe had turned murder into a business, and business was good, but no high lasts forever. No secret stays buried, and soon, Joe Methany's appetite would be his downfall. Joe Metheny had built something unique, something that gave him a level of satisfaction no job, no woman, no vice ever had before. His little roadside burger stand had become a favorite among truckers, night shift workers, and drifters who passed through Baltimore's industrial outskirts. Every day, he flipped burgers with a knowing grin, watching customers sink their teeth into the very thing that had once begged for its life in his warehouse. It wasn't just the act of feeding them that thrilled him anymore. It was the power. He watched them chew, swallow, and smile. They called his food the best they'd ever had, raved about the rich, savory flavor, the juiciness of the patties. Some even said they could never go back to eating regular fast food after tasting his. Joe took pride in that. He had turned his victims into something consumable, something desirable. The world had cast these people aside, prostitutes, addicts, the homeless, but he had given them purpose. He had made them useful. At first, he had been careful. He spaced out his kills, selecting his victims methodically. He never took anyone that would be missed, only those who had already been discarded by society. It was easy. The streets were filled with them, but as the weeks went on, his hunger grew. It wasn't just about keeping the burger stand running anymore. That was only part of it. The thrill of the hunt had become an addiction. At night, he prowled the streets, searching for his next ingredient. He knew where to go, which alleys to watch, which people to approach. He had a method now, a perfected routine. He would offer them food, sometimes a warm place to sleep, sometimes work at a stand. And when they agreed, when they followed him into the shadows, that was when the real work began. A ritual of flesh. Joe had always been a big man, towering, broad, a brute of sheer muscle. His size alone made him intimidating, but what made him truly dangerous was the calm. Even in the moments before a kill, his breathing stayed steady. His hands never shook. He would lead them to his warehouse, the one that had once been a rusting shell, but had now become his butcher's table. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old blood, the floor stained from countless nights of work. And there, under the dim flicker of a single hanging bulb, he would begin. He liked to talk to them first. He didn't have to. He could have done it quickly, choked them, stabbed them, ended it in seconds. But where was the fun in that? No, Joe wanted to see the moment they realized. He would sit them down, offer them a drink, sometimes even food. Other victims, unknowingly feeding on the ones who had come before them. And then, slowly, he would let the truth sink in. Sometimes it was a casual comment. "You ever wonder what you're eating?" he'd say, watching their expression shift. Other times, he'd let them see the remains. A stray bone left out, a hand discarded in the corner, a sliver of flesh still clinging to his knife. And then, the fear, the absolute, crushing understanding of where they were, of who he was. That was his favorite part, because then they would beg. They always begged. Some tried to run, but the warehouse was a maze, cluttered, dark, designed to trap. The moment they entered, their fate was sealed, and when he finally ended them, it was never rushed. Every slice, every cut was done with precision. He had perfected his craft, learned how to prepare the meat just right. He removed what was useless, cleaned what was needed, portioned and packed each part with the care of a professional. Nothing went to waste. He had become more than just a killer. He was a butcher, a chef. And every morning, as the sun rose over Baltimore, he would fire up his grill, season the fresh patties, and serve his customers. They had no idea what they were eating, and that was what made it delicious. The craving for more, but the problem with hunger is that it never stays satisfied. Joe had once been patient, careful, methodical, but now his appetites were growing out of control. He wasn't waiting weeks between kills anymore. Sometimes he went out hunting twice in one night. He wasn't just taking the homeless anymore either. He was getting bold. He started looking at new targets, people who wouldn't disappear so easily. Women walking home late, men who had pissed him off at the bar. He didn't care anymore. The thrill was overpowering the logic, and that was when he made a mistake. A woman, not an addict, not a prostitute, just a regular woman out on the streets at the wrong time. She fought harder than he expected. She got away. She ran through the dark streets bleeding, screaming for help, and the police found her, and she told them everything. Joe didn't know it yet, but his time was running out. The monster who had fed the city was about to be caught. Joe Metheny had always thought of himself as invincible. He had slipped through the cracks of the system for years, operating in the shadows, turning his victims into something more than just forgotten bodies. He had fed people their own kind, and they had loved it. They had paid for it. But now, his empire of flesh was beginning to crumble. The woman who had escaped was different from his usual victims. She wasn't a drug addict no one would look for. She wasn't homeless or forgotten. She was a person who mattered, someone with family, with a life that existed outside the dark alleys of Baltimore. And when she ran, blood streaming down her arms, clothes torn from the struggle, she didn't just disappear. She ran straight to the police, and she told them everything. At first, they didn't believe her. It was too insane, too grotesque. A man selling human meat in burgers, a warehouse filled with the butchered remains of his victims. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but she was covered in wounds. She was shaking, crying, screaming, and that was enough to make them look. The hunt begins. Joe didn't know yet that the police were coming for him. He was standing at his burger stand, flipping patties, laughing with customers, his massive frame towering over the small grill. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air, thick and rich. drawing in hungry travelers just like it always had. To him, it was just another day of business. To the police, it was the last meal he would ever serve. They didn't come in quietly. A fleet of patrol cars screeched into the lot, tires skidding across the pavement. Red and blue lights flashed against the metal siding of the roadside stand, reflecting in Joe's deep, set eyes, and then came the voices. Freeze, hands where we can see them. For a split second, Joe considered running. He was big, strong. He could take off into the woods, disappear into the streets like he had so many times before, but then he saw how many of them there were. They had surrounded him. There was nowhere to go. Slowly, methodically, Joe set the spatula down, his greasy hands raising in the air. He didn't say a word as they stormed forward, officers grabbing his arms, shoving him face down onto the asphalt. He could feel the heat of the grill behind him, could still hear the soft sizzle of cooking meat. And then, as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists, he let out a deep, rumbling laugh. They had no idea what they had just uncovered. Inside the house of horrors, the warehouse smelled of rot. Even the most hardened officers gagged when they stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the true nature of Joe Methany's crimes. It wasn't just a place where people died. It was a place where they were processed. Hooks hung from the ceiling, stained dark with old blood. A rusted meat grinder sat in the corner, its interior clogged with something unidentifiable. Bones, so many bones, were stacked in crates as if he had been saving them for some future purpose. And then there was the table, the long wooden slab where Joe had done his work. Knives were laid out neatly, each one sharpened to perfection. A scale sat nearby, still dusted with human flesh. Packages of meat, carefully wrapped, labeled with dates, filled a makeshift freezer. And the officers realized with dawning horror that they had eaten here before. They had come to his stand on late night shifts, had taken a break from patrolling to grab a burger from the friendly giant who always had a joke to tell. And now they knew what they had eaten. Some of them ran outside and vomited in the dirt. Joe's confession at the police station. Joe Metheny didn't hesitate to talk. He wanted them to know. He leaned back in the interrogation room, shackled to the table, a smirk playing on his lips as he detailed everything. The murders, the way he lured them in, how he processed the bodies, how he had served them to hundreds of people without them ever knowing. His voice was calm, almost proud. He even laughed when he told them how the customers had loved the taste. They ate it, he said, grinning at the horrified detectives. They ate every last bite, and they came back for more. The officers were silent, some of them pale, others gripping the edges of the table as if grounding themselves against the nightmare unfolding before them. Joe Metheny was not just a killer, he was a monster. And yet, despite everything, despite the evidence, despite the confessions, he did not regret a single thing. The trial of a cannibal. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, families of the missing, officers who had once unknowingly eaten at his stand. All of them came to see the man who had turned murder into a business. Joe sat there, massive, unbothered. The prosecution presented horrifying evidence, photographs of his work, audio recordings of his confession, testimonies from those who had nearly become his next meal. And Joe, he just smiled. It took the jury less than 2 hours to find him guilty. But when the death penalty was discussed, Joe leaned forward, resting his thick hands on the table, and said something that sent chills through everyone in the courtroom. "Death, that's too easy," he muttered. "I've been dead inside for years." Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. And so, the man who had once roamed the streets in search of his next meal was locked away forever. But some say that even behind bars, Joe Metheny never truly stopped hunting. Even in his cell, he would sit watching the guards, his cellmates, studying them as if calculating, as if waiting, because hunger like his, it never truly goes away. Joe Metheny was no longer a free man. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him inside a world where time stretched endlessly and the walls never moved. Prison was designed to break men, to strip them of their power, to remind them that the system had won. But for Joe, the transition was seamless. He did not panic, did not fight against his new reality. He simply adjusted, as if he had been expecting this all along. The weight of his crimes had not crushed him. If anything, they had elevated him. Behind bars, he became something more than a mere murderer. He became a legend, a whispered nightmare in the dim corridors of the penitentiary. The other inmates had seen killers before, had shared cells with thieves, gangsters, and men who had taken lives without remorse. But Joe was something different. He had crossed a line few dared to even acknowledge. He had consumed his victims, reducing them to nothing more than a meal, and that fact alone placed him in a category of his own. There were no threats against him, no initiation rituals, no silent tests of strength to establish his place in the prison's hierarchy. Fear had already carved a space for him, a wide berth that no one dared to cross. Whispers spread through the cell blocks before he had even arrived. The guards spoke his name with uneasy recognition, and the inmates watched him with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. His first night in prison was disturbingly quiet. In a place where survival depended on alliances and violence, he remained untouched. No one challenged him. No one tried to gauge his weaknesses. The usual prison rules did not seem to apply. He was a predator among men who thought themselves dangerous, but even they hesitated in his presence. He understood the system almost immediately. It was not about brute strength, but about controls. Psychological dominance over those who could be manipulated. And Joe had spent years perfecting that skill. He did not need to raise his fists or start conflicts. His mere presence, his history, his reputation, these were enough. Fear was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it effortlessly. The guards were no different from the inmates. They avoided his gaze when passing his cell, their movements tense, their interactions brief. He never acted out, never caused disruptions, but that made him even more unsettling. He simply observed, watched their routines, memorized their patterns, noted who was weak, who was indifferent, who was afraid. He existed within the structure of the prison like a shadow, pressing against its edges without breaking its rules. In the darkness of his cell, he remained still for hours. No tossing, no restless pacing, just silence. And in that silence, his mind wandered. The memories of his crimes never faded. The taste, the texture, the sensation of ultimate control. These were things prison could never take from him. He did not need to commit the acts again. The recollection alone was enough to sustain him. The image of flesh sizzling on a grill, the weight of a cleaver in his hands, the satisfaction of reducing a human being to nothing but nourishment. These thoughts remained vivid, untarnished by time. He had lost his freedom, but he had not lost his power. Over time, the routine of prison became predictable. The faces changed, but the dynamic remained the same. New inmates arrived, wary and uncertain, but it did not take long for them to hear the stories. They kept their distance, just as the others had. Even those who had spent years behind bars, who had learned to navigate the brutal world of incarceration, hesitated before stepping too close. He did not engage in meaningless conversation. He did not form alliances, did not seek protection, did not need to. His presence alone ensured his safety. His reputation was a shield stronger than any weapon. The guards monitored him carefully, but their unease betrayed them. Some refused to be assigned to his block. Others admitted in hushed tones that they avoided eating in his presence, as if the act of consuming food while under his gaze unsettled them in ways they could not explain. They spoke of him in half-whispers, as if afraid that acknowledging his presence too directly might invite something they could not control. He noticed everything, every shift in body language, every stolen glance, every avoidance. And he fed off it, not in the literal sense anymore, but in a way that still granted him a perverse satisfaction. He no longer needed to taste human flesh to feel the rush of control. The fear in their eyes was enough. The knowledge that, even caged, even powerless in the eyes of the law, he could still affect those around him. As the years passed, the prison became his hunting ground, not in the way it once had been, but in a different, more insidious form. He no longer needed to lure victims into his grasp. Now, they came to him involuntarily, in the form of guards who avoided his cell, inmates who refused to speak his name, new arrivals who learned too late that some legends were real. Joe Metheny was locked away, hidden from the world, but he had never truly been removed from it. His presence lingered, and in the depths of that prison, in the quiet moments between routine and repetition, he still held power. Even from behind bars, the monster remained. In the world outside, time moved forward without him. The city streets where he once prowled, the bars where he lured his victims, the bridge where he discarded their remains, these places still existed, but they no longer belonged to him. His name, however, never faded. Inside the walls of the prison, Joe Metheny was not forgotten. He was a presence that loomed over the facility like a specter, his crimes etched into the whispers of inmates and the nervous glances of guards. Unlike the fleeting reputation of a common murderer, his story carried something far more sinister. He was not just a man who had killed. He was a man who had turned his victims into meals, had reduced their existence to nothing more than sustenance. The idea of it unsettled even the most hardened criminals. There were men behind those bars who had butchered without hesitation, who had watched life slip away from their victims without remorse. But what Joe had done was something different. He had taken something intimate, something primal, and twisted it into an act of ultimate control, and in prison, control was everything. His routine was the same as any other inmate. He woke with the sound of the morning alarms, stood for the head counts, ate the same meals as the others. But there was something about him that set him apart. He moved differently, slower, as if he had all the time in the world. He did not engage in pointless conversations, did not participate in the power struggles that dictated life behind bars. He didn't have to. The weight of his name did all the work for him. Even the toughest men hesitated before crossing into his space. New arrivals, eager to prove themselves, were quickly warned. No one sat near him in the mess hall. No one dared to claim the bunk closest to his in the communal cell blocks. The stories about him had grown into something larger than life. Some whispered that he had killed more than he had admitted, that the bodies found were only a fraction of his real count. Others believed he still dreamed of the taste of human flesh, that even in prison, he longed for another chance. He never confirmed or denied any of it. Joe Metheny had nothing to prove. He had once lived as a predator in the outside world, blending into the background, choosing his victims carefully. He had built a reputation in secret, weaving a web of horror that no one saw until it was too late. Now, he did not need the cover of shadows or the anonymity of city streets. His name alone carried the same terror he had once created with his own hands. The guards were not immune to it either. They were trained to deal with men like him, killers, rapists, the worst that society had to offer. And yet, there was an unease in the way they interacted with him. They spoke in clipped tones, kept their distance when unlocking his cell. Some refused to eat in the same room as him, as if the simple act of sharing space with a cannibal was enough to unsettle their stomachs. There was one guard in particular who avoided him more than the others. A younger man, fresh to the job, his uniform still crisp, his posture still stiff with inexperience. Joe watched him carefully. The first time their eyes met, the guard had faltered, breaking eye contact too quickly. That was all Joe needed to know. Fear was a scent, and Joe had always had a keen sense for it. He played a slow, patient game as he always had. He did not speak to the guard directly, did not call attention to him. He simply observed. The way the man's hand trembled slightly when passing by his cell. The way he hesitated before making rounds in Joe's section of the prison. It was a small thing, but small things could be sharpened into weapons. Joe had learned long ago that psychological torment was just as satisfying as physical dominance. And here, in this place where he could no longer act on his old urges, he found a new way to feed. Days passed, then weeks. The guard's unease grew. One evening, as the last head count of the night was completed, Joe sat on the edge of his bunk, his hands resting on his knees, waiting. He knew the routine by now. The guards would make one final pass before locking everything down for the night. The young guard hesitated outside his cell. Joe did not move. He simply looked up, locking eyes with the man again, holding his gaze for just a moment too long. The guard's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His knuckles whitened around the baton at his waist. Joe tilted his head slightly, a slow, deliberate motion. The guard stepped back, breaking the stare, and moved on quickly. Joe smiled to himself. It was the smallest victory, the most subtle form of control, but it was control nonetheless. The days blurred together after that, but Joe never stopped watching. The guard's shifts became more erratic, his posture more rigid. He tried to hide it, but Joe saw everything. He always had. It wasn't long before the rumors spread. The other inmates began to notice. They saw the guard's discomfort, the way he avoided looking directly into Joe's cell. They started to whisper among themselves, adding fuel to the fire of Joe's legend. It was a slow, creeping poison, a seed planted deep in the man's mind, growing into something that couldn't be ignored. One night, Joe woke to the sound of a scuffle down the hall, raised voices, a commotion near the guard station. He listened, unmoving. The guard had snapped. Days of paranoia, of sleepless nights, of feeling watched. Whatever had been growing inside his head had finally cracked wide open. He had lashed out at another officer, an outburst that no one had expected. It wasn't physical, but it was enough to get him transferred. Joe never saw him again, but the victory remained. Even in a cage, stripped of the power he once held in the outside world, Joe Metheny still found ways to sink his claws into people. He did not need to spill blood to ruin someone. He did not need a weapon to destroy a man's mind. Fear had always been his sharpest tool, and even locked away, the monster inside him was never truly silent. The walls of his prison had not changed in years. The corridors remained the same, stretching in cold, lifeless monotony. The food was the same, bland, colorless, designed to sustain but never to satisfy. The faces changed though. Guards rotated, some aging out of their jobs, others leaving without explanation. Inmates came and went, some transferred, some released, some never making it out at all, but Joe Metheny remained. Time had carved itself into his body, settling deep into his bones. His once massive frame had softened, the raw physical strength he once carried dulled by years of stillness. His hair had thinned, the sharpness in his features worn down by age. But the eyes, those remained the same, cold, unreadable, the kind that could unnerve a man without ever needing to say a word. He had learned long ago that the mind was the one thing they could not truly cage. The body could be locked away, denied its cravings, but the mind was free to roam, and Joe's mind was never still. He lived in his memories now, let them play out in slow, indulgent loops. The weight of a cleaver in his hands, the warm resistance of flesh beneath a blade, the sound of meat sizzling over an open flame, the scent curling through the air, rich and unmistakable. These were not just memories. They were nourishment. The hunger had never left him. At first, it had been a physical craving, a gnawing, insatiable need that sat heavy in his gut, twisting at him like an animal clawing from the inside. Prison food was a mockery, a pale imitation of real sustenance. It was fuel, nothing more. The hunger had mocked him, whispered to him in the quiet moments of the night. He had been a king once in his own way. He had chosen who lived, who died, who became something more than just a victim, but those days were gone, at least in the way they once were, so he adapted. Hunger was a state of mind, after all. It was not just about what the body consumed, but what the soul craved. Joe had always been a patient man. He had known how to wait, how to bide his time, how to let things unfold naturally. And here, in this place where time itself seemed to stretch endlessly, he found new ways to feed. Fear, it was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the prison. It clung to the walls, seeped into the floors. Some men feared death, others feared weakness. Some feared the past, ghosts of their own making that followed them through every locked door. Joe Metheny had once feared nothing, and that made him something to be feared. It had started small, the way it always did. A single moment, a single glance. A new inmate had arrived. A younger man, lean, wiry, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. Fresh meat, the others had already begun circling, testing him, waiting to see where he would fall in the hierarchy. Joe had seen it 1,000 times before. Some men folded immediately, crumbling under the weight of survival. Others fought, tried to carve out a place for themselves before they realized the system had already decided their fate. This one, though, he was different. He was afraid, yes, but not in the way most were. His fear was not of the prison itself, not of the violence or the isolation. His fear ran deeper, rooted in something older, something more personal. Joe watched him, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention. Just enough, just long enough to plant a seed. The young man avoided his gaze at first, kept his head down, kept his distance, but Joe knew how this game was played. It was never about force, it was about control. One day, in the yard, Joe sat on one of the benches, his posture relaxed, unbothered by the noise around him. The young man was nearby, standing alone, his eyes flicking around, always watching, always wary. Joe didn't speak, didn't move, he simply waited, and then, when the moment was right, when the young man's eyes finally landed on him, Joe smiled, not a grin, not a sneer, just a small, knowing smile. The effect was immediate. The young man stiffened, his entire body going rigid, his breathing quickening just slightly. He turned away too fast, his movements jerky, unnatural. Joe had him now. It didn't take much after that. A glance here, a lingering stare there, no words were needed. Within a week, the young man had stopped sleeping properly. Joe could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, in the way he flinched at small sounds. He was unraveling piece by piece. By the second week, he had requested a transfer. Joe never spoke to him, never laid a hand on him. He never needed to. That was the beauty of it. Some men carved their names into the world with violence, with blood, with brutality. Joe Metheny had done all of that once, and he had enjoyed every second of it. But now, he found a different satisfaction. There was power in silence. There was power in being the thing that others feared even when he did nothing at all. The hunger had not left him. It had only changed. He had learned to feed on something else. And in the quiet, in the stillness of his cell, he smiled. Because he knew the monster they had locked away was still very much alive. Joe Metheny had been many things in his life: a son, a soldier, a laborer, a drifter, a killer. But above all, he had always been a predator. Even in his youth, before the bloodshed, before the hunger took hold, he had understood the nature of power. It was never about brute strength alone. No, true power lay in control, the ability to manipulate, to bend the world to your will without ever needing to lift a finger. In the outside world, he had done just that. He had chosen his prey carefully, learned their patterns, exploited their weaknesses. He had lured them in with lies, with promises, with the illusion of safety. And when the moment was right, he had taken everything from them. First their freedom, then their flesh, and finally their existence. But now, inside these walls, he was the one in captivity. The steel bars, the sterile routines, the watchful eyes of guards and inmates alike. It was a world designed to strip a man of his control, to reduce him to a number, a routine, a cog in the machine. And yet, Joe remained what he had always been. Even in a cage, a predator was still a predator. The others could sense it. They may not have understood it fully, may not have been able to put it into words, but they felt it all the same. It was in the way they gave him space in the mess hall, the way their conversations quieted when he passed by. It was in the sidelong glances, the murmured stories, the unspoken understanding that Joe Metheny was not like the rest of them. Murderers filled these halls, rapists, gangsters, butchers of every kind, and yet Joe stood apart because his crimes were different, because his crimes were not just about killing, because his crimes had crossed a threshold that even the worst of men hesitated to approach. Cannibal, the word followed him like a shadow, whispered in the corners of the prison, spoken with a mix of horror and disbelief. Some of them didn't believe it, thought it was just another prison myth, a tale meant to scare the weak. But those who knew, the ones who had read the reports, the ones who had seen the evidence, those men stayed silent because they knew the truth, and they knew that monsters were real. Joe watched them all with quiet amusement. He had no need for alliances, no interest in the politics of prison life. He did not seek protection, nor did he offer it. He simply existed, moving through his days with the same unsettling calm that had unnerved his victims in the outside world. And yet, despite his isolation, Joe still played his games. There was no thrill in violence here, no opportunity to indulge in the pleasures of the hunt, but control. Control could be taken in many ways. So he watched. He watched the guards, learning their routines, their habits. He watched the other inmates, picking up on their fears, their insecurities. He watched the new arrivals, the ones who came in died and uncertain, still clinging to the belief that they could survive this place without being changed by it. And when he found the right one, when he sensed weakness, he made his move. It was never direct, never obvious. That was the beauty of it. A word here, a glance there, a subtle shift in posture, a deliberate pause before answering a question. It was enough. Fear did not need force to take root. It needed only suggestion, and once it had burrowed its way in, once the cracks began to form, the rest was inevitable. Joe had always known this. He had always understood that the mind was the most delicate thing of all. And here, in this place where the strong preyed upon the weak, he had found a new way to feed. It was not the same as before, not the raw, visceral satisfaction of the kill, but it was enough, because at the end of the day, he was still what he had always been. A predator, a monster, a hunger that could never truly be satisfied. Fear was a flavor Joe Metheny had learned to savor. It was not the same as flesh, not the same as that deep, primal satisfaction of tasting something forbidden, but it had its own richness. It lingered in the air, in the hesitant glances, in the subtle shift of body language when someone realized they were standing too close to him. It was intoxicating in its own way. He had spent his years behind bars perfecting the art of feeding off it. Not in the crude, mindless way the other predators in this place did, through brute force, through violence, through bared teeth and clenched fists. No, Joe had never needed to rely on such things. He understood something they did not. Violence was temporary, fear was forever, and so, as the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, Joe continued his slow, deliberate games. He had no need to rush. Fear was like a good cut of meat. It needed time to marinate, to absorb its surroundings, to reach its full potential. And his latest project was ripening perfectly. The new inmate, the one who had caught his eye weeks ago, had begun to unravel. The first signs were always subtle, a stiffness in his movements, the way he ate less, his appetite shrinking under the weight of something he could not name. The way he glanced over his shoulder more often, as if sensing a presence even when Joe was nowhere near. Joe was patient. He did not need to speak to the man. He did not need to touch him. He only needed to exist. And existence, when wielded correctly, was the most powerful weapon of all. By the time the man finally snapped, by the time he broke down in the middle of the yard, eyes wild, muttering about something unseen, something lurking just beyond his vision, Joe knew he had one. And the beauty of it, no one would ever know he had been the one to do it. There would be no fingerprints, no evidence, no trail leading back to him. Just a man, driven to madness by nothing but his own mind. Joe savored the victory, not because he took pleasure in suffering. No, that was too simple, too crude. It was because it reminded him of who he was. Even here, in a place designed to break men, he remained untouched, untamed, and most importantly, unchanged. But there was something else, something deeper, because while he had spent these years feeding off fear, drawing sustenance from the control he still held over others, there was one hunger he could never quite suppress. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface. A craving not just for power, not just for fear, but for the thing that had truly set him apart. The thing that had made him more than just another killer. Meat, real meat. The kind that had once dripped from his fingers, that had sizzled on his grill, that had filled the air with a scent so rich, so unmistakable, that even now, years later, it haunted his senses. It was the one thing this place could never give him, the one indulgence forever denied, and yet, in the quiet, in the long, empty hours of the night, he could still taste it, still feel it between his teeth, still remember the way it had felt to serve it, to strangers, to unsuspecting customers, to the very people who had walked past him on the streets, unaware of the truth, that hunger had never died, it had only been caged. And a caged hunger was a dangerous thing, because sooner or later, one way or another, it would find a way to be fed. Hunger was a strange thing. Most men in this place knew it only in its simplest form, the dull, familiar ache of an empty stomach, the irritation of prison food that never satisfied. The meals here were nothing more than a necessity, barely edible portions of lifeless mush served on plastic trays. The other inmates complained about it, about how the portions were too small, about how the taste was non-existent, about how they longed for the rich, greasy flavors of the outside world. But Joe Metheny didn't complain, because the hunger he knew was different. It wasn't the gnawing emptiness of an unfed stomach. It wasn't even about the food itself, not in the way others thought of it. His hunger was something deeper, something rooted in the core of who he was. It had lived inside him long before he ever picked up a cleaver, long before he ever served his first customer, and it had never left him. Even now, in the sterile monotony of his prison cell, the hunger remained. It was quieter than before, buried under years of confinement, but it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, like a caged animal pacing in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold wall, letting his mind drift to the past. And just like that, he was back there again, not in this lifeless place, not trapped behind concrete and steel, but outside, in the real world, in his world. The heat from the grill, the weight of the cleaver in his hand, the rich, intoxicating scent of sizzling meat rising into the night air, the flickering glow of the fire, casting shifting shadows around his little roadside stand, and the people, oh, the people. They came for the food, their faces lit up with eager anticipation, their stomachs empty, their minds blissfully unaware. They handed over crumpled bills without hesitation, smiling as they took their sandwiches, as they sank their teeth into the tender, juicy meat. They never questioned it, never asked what made it so rich, so flavorful, so unlike anything they had ever tasted before. They just ate, and with every bite, with every satisfied sigh, Joe had felt something deeper than hunger. Something close to satisfaction, because it wasn't just about the food. It was about knowing what they were eating, knowing that he had made them a part of something they could never take back. Knowing that his secret was inside them now, that they had unknowingly crossed a line they could never uncross. That was what he had truly fed on, Not the meat itself, but the power, the control. And now, here in this place, stripped of everything, he was starving. It had been years since his last meal, years since he had last felt the raw, primal thrill of turning something human into something consumable. The thought sent a slow, familiar pulse through his veins, a reminder of the hunger that would never truly die. He could still remember the taste, still remember the texture, still remember the way it had filled his mouth, the way it had settled deep in his stomach, a meal unlike any other. Nothing else had ever come close. Nothing ever would. And so, night after night, he sat in his cell, trapped in a body that still remembered what it meant to feast, haunted by a hunger that could never be satisfied. He had tried to distract himself, had tried to find new ways to feed. Fear had been a temporary substitute, something to sustain him, to give him some small semblance of control. Watching the weaker men crack, unraveling under the weight of their own paranoia, had given him a certain pleasure. But it wasn't enough, because fear could never be consumed. Because no matter how much he enjoyed watching others crumble, it never filled him the way a meal had, and that was the problem, wasn't it? No matter how much time passed, no matter how much prison tried to strip him down, tried to break him, he was still the same. The hunger had not died, it had only been caged. But caged things did not simply disappear. They waited, they bided their time, they grew restless, and if there was one thing Joe Metheny knew, it was that nothing stayed locked away forever, not a beast, not a secret, and certainly not a hunger like his. Not if it still had ways to be fed. Hunger was patient. It did not fade with time. It did not shrink or wither away simply because it was ignored. It waited. It lingered, always present, always whispering, a quiet but persistent voice at the back of the mind. Joe Metheny understood this better than anyone. For years, he had carried that hunger, nurtured it, fed it in ways that no other man could comprehend. It had driven him, shaped him, defined the very core of who he was. It had been his compass, his purpose, his reason for existing, and now, here in this place, in a cage built for lesser men, he was left with nothing but time, time to remember, time to relive, time to fantasize about the things he would never taste again. That was the cruelest part of all, not the confinement, not the absence of freedom, not even the dull, lifeless food that was shoved onto his tray each day, food that held no texture, no richness, no substance. It was the memory of what had once been his. He could still see it if he closed his eyes, the way the meat glistened as it cooked, juices dripping onto the grill, sizzling as they hit the hot metal, the smoky aroma that filled the air, rich and unmistakable. The weight of the cleaver in his hand, the solid, satisfying feel of it as it sliced cleanly through flesh. The slow, deliberate process of turning something raw into something consumable, something that could be served, something that could be devoured. There had been a rhythm to it, a ritual, hunting, preparing, cooking, serving. Each step had been a pleasure, each part necessary, each moment leading to the final, most satisfying act, watching someone take that first bite. They had never known that was what had made it perfect. They had eaten, laughed, licked their fingers clean, never once questioning what had been placed in front of them. They had trusted him, trusted the food, trusted the world around them. They had been blind, and he had taken pleasure in that blindness because it meant that he had power. He had always believed that true power did not come from brute strength, from fear or intimidation, from the ability to dominate a room with presence alone. True power was invisible, it was quiet, it was subtle. It was the ability to make people do things without them even realizing it. And what greater power was there than making a man consume the very thing he feared the most? That was what Joe Metheny had taken from them. Not just their flesh, not just their lives, but their ignorance, their security, their sense of control. And now, locked in this place, surrounded by men who thought themselves dangerous, who thought themselves monsters. He was forced to live among fools. They had no idea what true hunger was. They thought it was the empty feeling in their stomachs after a meal that wasn't enough. They thought it was the frustration of a craving that couldn't be satisfied, the longing for a cigarette, a drink, a woman. They did not know what it meant to ache for something deeper, something darker, something that could never be replaced. But Joe knew. He sat in his cell, eyes half closed, listening to the distant sounds of the prison around him. The heavy footsteps of guards patrolling the halls, the occasional clang of a metal door, the murmured voices of men who had no idea what real hunger was. They thought they were killers. They thought they were predators, but they were nothing. They were animals trapped in a cage, lashing out at each other because they had no real power, no real control. They fought over scraps, over territory, over respect. It was pathetic. Joe had never needed to fight for respect. He had never needed to prove himself through violence or dominance. He had never needed to establish himself as the biggest, the strongest, the most feared. Because he had already won, long before he was ever caught, long before they dragged him into this place, long before they tried to lock away the thing he truly was. He had already done what none of them ever could. He had taken something from the world that could never be undone. It had been swallowed, consumed, made part of the very people who had hunted him, who had tried to end him, and that would never change. No prison cell could erase what he had done. No judge, no jury, no sentence could undo what had already been taken. The world had already eaten from his hands, and that in itself was enough. But the hunger remained. And hunger, no matter how deep it was buried, no matter how long it was ignored, always found a way to surface again. Because a man like Joe Metheny, he was not meant to be contained. He was not meant to starve. And deep down in the darkest parts of himself, he knew one thing for certain: one day, the hunger would find a way to be fed again. It always did. There were certain truths in this world that no prison cell could erase, no legal system could rewrite. Some men were simply made different. Some hungers could never be starved out. Some beasts were never meant to be tamed. Joe Metheny was one of them. The walls around him were thick, built from cold concrete meant to suffocate the spirits of the men inside. The bars were strong, forged to keep monsters like him from ever walking free again. But prison was just a place, a construct, a physical limitation. It did nothing to change who he was. It did nothing to dull the hunger. He sat in his cell alone, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, tracing the jagged patterns with his eyes. The world outside had moved on without him, but in his mind, he was still there, still at that little roadside stand, still flipping patties on the grill, still serving up his special kind of meat to the unsuspecting public. That was the thing about memory. It was sharper than any knife, more intoxicating than any meal. He could still hear the sizzle of the fat as it dripped onto the fire, still smell the smoky richness that filled the air. The hunger in his stomach was nothing compared to the hunger in his mind, because he wasn't just hungry for food. He was hungry for control, for the thrill of it, for the knowledge that he had taken something no one could ever get back. That was what had always fed him the most, the knowing that somewhere out there, people still walked the streets, still went about their daily lives, still carried inside them the remnants of something they could never erase. They had eaten from his hands, and that made them his. Even if they never knew it, even if they never suspected a thing, that thought alone was enough to sustain him, even here, even now. But deep down, the hunger still whispered. It still lingered in the dark corners of his mind, curling around his thoughts like smoke, and he knew in the same way he had always known, that if fate had given him just one more chance, just one more night of freedom, he would have fed again. Because the truth was simple. Hunger never dies, it only waits, and some men were born to feed, even if they were never given the chance again, even if they rotted away behind bars, even if the world forgot their name. Because in the end, Joe Metheny had already won. The people who had tasted his meals, the ones who had unknowingly swallowed his secret, they were still out there, and as long as they lived, so did he. Because they had become a part of him, just as he had become a part of them. And that was a hunger that could never be undone, never erased, never starved away. It would live on forever.